Hello and welcome everyone who is participating in this webinar from around the world. My name is Alice Gibson and I'm the Principal Manager for Capacity Development at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This webinar is actually in a series of 3 on a theme of CCS in developing countries, and I certainly encourage you to listen to the first 2 recordings in this series. The first one was on the status of CCS in developing countries, which I presented on, and the second one was on a roadmap for CCS demonstration and deployment for the People's Republic of China, and that was presented by the Asian Development Bank. And like the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank has a dedicated carbon capture and storage trust fund, which the Institute, the Norwegian government and the UK government are donors to. So we at the Institute are very pleased to have Natalia Kulishenko-Lotz from the World Bank talk to us today about key issues and barriers in developing countries, with an emphasis on South Africa as a case study. So I'll just introduce our presenter today. Natalia Kulishenko-Lotz is a senior energy specialist in the energy and extractive global practice at the World Bank. You can see on the slide there that her work addresses energy sector policy dialogue and sector reform, coal and gas-fired power generation, transmission and distribution networks, energy access, as well as advanced energy technologies, including solar power and carbon capture and storage. She holds a PhD in chemical engineering, a master's in electrical engineering, and an MBA with a specialization in international finance. Dr. Kulishenko-Lotz currently manages the World Bank's energy sector portfolio in Tanzania and CCS programs in South Africa, Botswana, and Mexico. So you can see that Natalia is very well placed to be talking to us about CCS in developing countries from the World Bank's experience. Now, all participants are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation through the Questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, which you should see on your screen, and it should look like the picture that's on the slide there. At the end of Natalia's presentation, I will be asking her your questions. And now, without further ado, let me hand over to Natalia. Over to you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this webinar, and thank you for the opportunity to present the work which the World Bank doing, but also to present the interest and concerns and of our client countries with regard to CCS, because it's very important that we understand what exactly the specific questions which we have to answer during our work in developing countries. So on the slide which is right now on your screen, I put a presentation overview. And some of these themes like technology development and international trends, I just briefly touch upon, but the majority of the time of the presentation I will devote to the discussions on the CCS development in the CCS work in development. The stage of technology, I mean, many of you who are involved in the CCS field know that the progress was quite substantial during the last 2-3 years. We have several projects close to finalizing the preparation and commercialization. We have also the boundary dam being commissioned. So the trends are there on the technology development side. To the next slide. I put this slide on purpose from IEA to show that basically renewable energy dominates the trend in climate change all over the world. And that is important to understand that the World Bank as international financing institution to developing country follows the same trend. You know, we receive our funds from donor countries, and in many cases, we are asked to expedite the deployment of renewables versus technologies like CCS, which are considered less beneficial for in terms of economic development, which is true. So in terms of our lending, we as a World Bank, we are definitely progressing on lending to renewables, but we have, although we are not lending directly to any coal power projects, we are still getting requests from our client countries how we can address CO2 emissions reductions in a manner which makes sense in our countries. Climate targets, as we know from the IPCC report, cannot be achieved without CCS, or it will be achieved at a much higher cost, which again comes, the cost will be imposed not only on industrialized countries, but also on developing countries, which are still in the process of growing their economies and addressing poverty issues to a big extent. Many of countries don't have even access to electricity at a scale which mid-income countries have. For instance, in Tanzania, where I work, only 7% of rural population do have access to electricity. On the other hand, the country has huge coal resources, and they are seriously thinking about developing it. So in situations like this, it's very important for them to understand what are their options and where CCS fits in their both development agenda and climate change mitigation strategies. Greater CCS deployment obviously depends on a stringent climate change policies. And with respect to developing countries, not many of them have climate change policies per se. Some of them quite advanced, and I can cite South Africa is on the front run of the climate change policy development. But especially countries which are less developed, and the least developed countries definitely not have a stringent climate change mitigation policies. They all opt for adaptation or very for the modest climate change goals. That's why the lead on from the industrialized countries on policy development is very important. And if it's a global climate change policy, binding policy, it will be the most important achievement, not only for countries like US, China, or EU, but also for African region, South Asia region, and so far, so forth. We work in developing countries on CCS for already more than 6 years. And here on this slide, I was trying to kind of summarize what we learned over this 6-year period from our clients and working with our clients. As I mentioned earlier, the lack of global climate change policy and international binding commitments in industrialized countries is really a discouraging signal for the countries where a World Bank is active, because the argument is that if the EU, China ahead in industrial development, they have to take harder and larger commitments. Financing mechanisms, specifically with regard to CCS, while with renewable energy technologies, there are some quite a substantial set of grants, concessional financing is available. With regard to CCS, practically nothing, with the exception of a couple of few trust funds, nothing is available for not only project financing, but also for capacity building. Lack of capacity, both technical, human, organizational. I just thought, for instance, if tomorrow some financing will be available for development of CCS in all developing countries, it won't be possible to implement, because there is people just don't know what to do, how to design the project, how to design a regulatory regime, how to design technical standards. Basically capacity is has to be developed in parallel, if not before the financing mechanism are finalized or even discussed. And as earlier mentioned, regulatory frameworks. It takes a long time to first to define what should be done within the existing frameworks, and then to decide whether to go for a specific climate, CCS legislation, or just to modify the existing regulations, because it depends, definitely on the sophistication of the existing system and the goals of the country. Some of the countries, as I mentioned later in the presentation, do intend to implement pilot projects. Some of them just need to sit and wait what happens in the neighboring countries. So, and it takes a long time to introduce a new legislation or even modified one. I mean, in my experience, from 2 to 3 years, to finalize anything new in the regulatory framework. So this one definitely requires a lot of long lead times plus additional capacity. And then the last point, but not the least, what we hear all the time: cost, and cost. CCS comes at the cost to the generation industry, to industrial, to industries. The country is losing power in the situation when they have deficit in power, when they have a lot of electrification goals to achieve. So basically, the specific countries have to make decisions, have to select between adopting CCS as a climate change mitigation technology and give preferences to development agenda and electrify villages at the expense of climate change. Of course, it can be both, but again, at the state where many countries, developing countries, are, and at the political level where they are, definitely the development agenda takes priority. So I borrowed this slide from this earlier presentation, and it's actually a very good description of the status where developing countries are. So I pick countries like South Africa, which is, as I said, one of the front runners in terms of CCS, and still, even the discussion on basic design of financing mechanisms is missing. So in order to move from stage of opportunity to at least the stage of project, pilot project development, the financing should be available, the capacity should be built, regulations should be in place. A lot of things should happen before even starting advertising contractors for advertising contracts for pilot project development. In terms of cost, which I mentioned, which is the biggest concern, and it's a lot of misperception what exactly the cost of CCS. It doesn't mean that the CCS is cheap, but it's still in line with major other technologies, and many people don't realize it. But what is the disadvantage specific of CCS? It's not. It doesn't have any other benefits. Doesn't have any benefits other than climate change, and that's the discouraging signal specifically for clients in developing countries, because for them, renewable, even if it's expensive, it still gives an opportunity to generate power. CCS is purely a climate change mitigation technology. And again, coming to the earlier point, unless the stringent climate change policies are in place, it's very difficult to encourage clients. Although, I mean, we're still trying to develop capacity for CCS, because it sooner or later, in my view, climate change policies global will be developed, and maybe financing mechanisms through the ongoing development of a Green Climate Fund and some other funds. So what the World Bank is doing, I was trying to explain, what we have difficulties, but we are not giving up on our clients. So we started, with capacity building. And as Alice mentioned, the trust fund of the World Bank was established in 2009 with the donors, support from Global CCS Institute, the UK and Norway. And basically with two objectives: to support, strengthen capacity and knowledge building, and to facilitate the inclusion of CCS option in developing country low carbon strategies and policies. With some efforts, we were able to raise quite a substantial amount of money, 57 million, it's right now capitalized. And our work started with phase one, which was purely capacity building, basically no physical activity on the ground. And we approached, took a broad approach. We talked to all our clients and said, if you are interested in CCS, submit your expression of interest, and we can consider supporting some of analytical studies in order to build knowledge and transfer this knowledge to your countries. So we got requests from 9 countries, and we supported capacity building. And then we realized, okay, that was a good start. Then we have to concentrate on countries who can move CCS forward. And these countries, basically those which have CCS as part of their climate change strategy, which in these cases, strong cases were appear to be in Mexico and South Africa. And briefly on the next slide, I described where we are in Mexico, which is behind the South African program, but is going in the same direction. So in the first phase, we did have some analytical study. We are still, they're still not finished. They are going, and we believe that we'll finish it in December 2015. After which, phase one, we plan to move to phase two, which was discussed already and agreed with the government of Mexico. And phase two will run for 5 years. Doing all the activities, detailed design of the pilot project, implementation, measures to convert the PEMEX injection of CO2 for EOR purposes into a permanent storage project, establish a CCS center in Mexico, make changes in legal and regulatory frameworks, and assess the emission reduction in Mexico due to CCS. So this is a 5-year program, but what it will fund, it will definitely fund a pilot project in Mexico. Again, the details are still yet to be developed based on the results of the phase one studies. In South Africa, we have finished the first phase, during which we did the technical economic assessment of CCS deployment, on which I stop in detail later in the presentation. But also we provided recommendations to the changes in the regulatory framework. We funded a public engagement study and provided some funding for capacity building. And phase two will help South Africa to co-finance a pilot storage project, and hopefully, if the funds will remain, also a capture project. The storage project is part of the CCS roadmap, which was developed by the Department of Energy with the CCS Center of South Africa. So basically, we just, as a World Bank, we stepped in the middle of the process with our support. And half of the pilot injection project will be funded, about 50% will be funded by the government of South Africa, and about 50% will come from the World Bank CCS Trust Fund. CCS is very important for South Africa. That's why I mentioned when we finish phase 1 of activities of the World Bank CCS Trust Fund, we decided to concentrate on those countries where CCS does make sense in terms of climate change mitigation. And as you see, South Africa is a heavy coal-based economy with and 7th largest coal producer in the world. So with this, coal reserves remains to be the main fuel for the economic growth of the country. It's very important that CCS at least proven to be feasible in South Africa. And at this stage, without a pilot project, it's difficult to assess how much CO2 can be stored in geological formations of South Africa. That is the purpose of doing a pilot project. Back in 2010, the World Bank did the technical economic assessment of assessing how much it's going to cost the deployment of CCS in some countries, and we picked specific regions, which was Southern Africa and the Balkans. And based on this assessment, 2010, we estimated that with a carbon price of about $50 US per ton, it's feasible to do certain CCS, the full integrated project in certain conditions with post-combustion, for instance. And oxy-fuel also was feasible. So based on this, we in 2013 we decided to do a more detailed technical economic assessment in South Africa and assess a specific assess what would be the cost and the potential of deployment of and commercialization of CCS in South Africa up to 2050. And with the potential storage site capacity analyzed in more details than we did back in 2010. So what in this assessment we considered specific outputs that emitters were not only the electricity generation industry, but also the industrial sector that was missing in the previous assessment, 2010, where we considered only the power generation industry. Inputs were cost and capture technology for each emitter, pipelines, storage model, and calculate the cost of the impact of CCS deployment. What the outputs we received? It was the volumes of CO2 which would be possible to capture with the CCS technology and store between 20 and 2050 in each sector. We also received information about incremental cost of CCS deployment, again by sector, investment requirements, impact on electricity generation cost per ton of CO2, and impact on cost for different CCS technologies and storage, and also timescale cost for deployment. As I mentioned, we took specific examples from data from the electricity utility ESCOM, from a chemical company SSO, and a number of other industries such as cement, fuel refineries, metals, and paper and pulp industries. But the main focus, of course, was the ESCOM, the utility current coal fleet, which is quite substantial, and to see what would be the cost implications if the utility will deploy the CCS technology. The capture, that is the criteria in the model which we consider that the H plant should be more than 10 years remaining after the date of potential application. The emissions will be not less than 40,000 per year. Availability of water, because the water is one of the main constraints in the Southern Africa region. Availability of land and transportation. So in terms of storage, we potentially assessed several basins. Again, it's not, we didn't have, the consultants also didn't have very detailed geological information on that, but it's assumed, and based on the information from the Council on Geological Sciences, that these basins could absorb some amounts, and each basin approximately assess how much can be stored in these basins. So what volumes were defined during the study, as a result of the study? In power generation, of course, the sites with CO2 capture was the largest, and the amount of annual CO2 capture rate was the highest. But also in metal industry, cement and paper, and actually what was a little bit surprising, then refining and coal to liquid and coal to gas industries came, the potential came a little bit less than, the amount of site with CO2 capture was less than in metal industry. Operating cost, it was both, the power sector, both capture, capex and opex were derived from existing models, and model as real cost based on 2013 data. We also considered the combined cycle gas turbine plants and IGCC as a proxy for high cost scenario for combustion, although there is no IGCC plants in South Africa as such. Cost also included the investment required to replace net output loss as a result of the implementation of capture. And for industrial sector, capex also was derived from the published sources because the industry did not provide us with specific plant operating costs, but on the more like a higher level, it was sufficient. Again, what we got to know out of this economic results of the assessment. Capture cost in power generation is expected, and actually it's quite high. The lowest in paper is the paper industry, but the volumes, as I remember the previous slide, the volumes are not there is much lower. So it's there's a kind of a trade-off. I mean, the higher volumes you have, the more expensive it becomes. In terms of consolidated capex and opex by sector, is again not surprisingly, as you can see, that the power generation sector is the most expensive in terms of capital requirements and operating cost requirements. Where again the capture, again not surprise, comprises the highest portion of the cost, between 70 and 80%. In terms of levelized cost by sector, again, the most interesting case, of course, from everyone's perspective, is power generation, where the biggest emission. And incremental cost, although it's presented in South African rands, but okay, approximately divided by 10, it's very roughly. So you can see that the incremental cost increase is about more than 5 cents per kilowatt hour, or $5 per megawatt hour, which is quite a substantial amount, to increase if the tariff is passed to the consumers. The cost is very substantial. It seems to be in the cement industry, and the lowest cost in the refining industry, which would be a good candidate at least for the first capture, although they have the capture already, to take CO2 as a source for the pilot storage project. Here is again the base case for levelized cost by sector. The cement sector comes almost at par with the generation sector, which again we thought that all other sectors but generation would be much lower. And it seems like that the cement sector, which would be a good candidate for the capture, for a pilot capture plant, would be very expensive in South Africa. So impact on electricity. Average rate consumer, I mean, at the time of the assessment, the average consumer price was 503 rand per megawatt hour, and additional cost basically, as this is the bottom line, exceeded the average consumer price, which means that, coming back to the point of concern of our client countries, cost is definitely proves the case that addressing the issue of cost reduction for CCS technology is very important for developing countries in particular. And if you know the situation in South Africa right now, that Eskom is already having problems with supply, with electricity supply. If the additional cost in CCS and reduction of output will be as a result of the CCS deployment, definitely not a desirable scenario for the government and the consumers as well. Here is the impact on the cost, in the tabular form. Again, as we discussed before, the impact on is practically CCS is even more important than the CCS is more costly than the production at the moment. Coming back to the pilot project which we are developing right now, we're helping the South African government and the CCS Center to develop. Here are the highlights and what exactly will be done. Again, our role is only the assistance of the to assist with this with the storage project. It's a pure South African initiative, which is very encouraging. We hope by the time that the pilot project start and injecting and the monitoring results will be evaluated, the development of the capture technology will take its place and the cost reductions may be achieved and the situation will be more favorable to advocate CCS deployment in South Africa. Or in addition, some financing mechanism might become available. The Green Climate Fund might start its operation. And at the moment, CCS technology is eligible for financing from that source. So some development might happen, and before even considering a larger demonstration capture project, integrated project, the pirate storage should be completed in order, as I said before, to assess whether the storage can be is realistic in the South African conditions. That's everything what I wanted to cover, but I would be happy to hear your questions and answers if something is unclear. More additional information is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for that very comprehensive overview of particularly what you're doing in South Africa. Now, I do have some questions here already, but I do invite you all to submit any further questions you might have by using the questions tab on your control panel and just send them through at any stage. So, Natalia, kickstarting off with the first question, what financing mechanisms has the World Bank used to support CCS so far, and what financing mechanisms might the World Bank use in the future?
Can you hand over to me? Do you hear me?
Oh yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay. For this specific case, we used only grant financing. That for these purposes, that was this trust fund was established. So basically, it's free to our clients. But in the future, and I mentioned 2010 study, which the World Bank did, we did assess how to use our lending instruments for CCS projects. And CCS means not pure CCS, but CCS combined with a generation project, for instance. So we do have specific instruments which might be helpful to use. In particular, lending, World Bank lending combined with some concessional financing from the Clean Technology Fund, which provide very concessional loans. Plus, co-financing from grants, we have some grant schemes here. So basically, we can reduce the amount of lending, the cost of lending for our clients if it's a climate change mitigation technology, and we do it in case of renewables in many places. What else? Definitely the upcoming Green Climate Fund, which has the mechanism of co-funding projects, climate change projects with international financing institutions. And in this case, it can be a large scale because pure grant financing won't take you too far. So it should be combined with some concessional funding, which usually the international finance institutions like the World Bank provide. It's our terms are not market terms. It's dependent on the country, but in countries like in many countries in Africa, it's our loans are interest free and have 40 years grace period.
So yeah, concession. So it's really grants at the moment, but concessional loans will be key moving forward.
A combination of grants and concessional loans.
Yeah. You sort of touched on the Green Climate Fund, which sort of links to another question. How do you see the World Bank working with other multilateral organisations to help implement CCS? Organisations like other development banks or the Green Climate Fund under the UNFCCC or that organisation?
Well, actually, it's already taken place. We have in terms of CCS, we just started collaboration with Asian Development Bank in Indonesia, and might actually do a joint project. It's still under discussion. Or in China, it's potential overlap we can have. But we are open to any other collaboration in Africa with the African Development Bank, and in Latin America with the Inter-American Development Bank. We definitely cooperate with many other institutions who are involved in CCS. But with regard with the to Green Climate Fund, again, it's not the World Bank who will be also defining the operation modalities of the fund. It's right now under preparation, and one of the modalities is to co-finance, to provide co-financing to loans, concessional loans from I5, international financing institutions, with grants from the Green Climate Fund. Exactly the same mechanism as is used for Clean Technology Fund. That's one of the options, but the Green Fund has already raised several of them, and it might provide direct funding for projects, make co-finance with national governments. So there's a set of options how it will be done. What is important that CCS technology as such is there, while
it's eligible.
Yes, while in the Clean Technology Fund, it's not the technology which the Clean Technology Fund can provide financing for.
All right, thanks, Natalia. I've got another question here. Can you say a bit more about what the pilot project in Mexico will entail? Will it capture CO2 from a power plant or a refinery, for instance?
At the moment, we are still designing it, and we have there right now a pre-feasibility study, which should start very, very soon. Our intention is to have basically two projects. One is, as I mentioned in the presentation, is to convert a CO2 EOR site into a CCS EOR project. So basically doing monitoring. And the second one is a capture, pilot capture. And what we intend to do with the discussion, based on the discussion with our counterparts, what they want to do. They want to do it in a gas power plant. A gas power plant, and not a green one, but a refurbished one. And just to do to add the CO2 capture unit. Again, the cost might be prohibitively high. The design might not be there. At the moment, we are, as I said, we are doing a pre-feasibility study. And when we finish this, we come up with a conclusion whether it's feasible or not doing. But the intention is to do in a gas plant.
Mm-hmm. And what's the timelines for that, for that feasibility study, and then if it is feasible, to move towards a pilot project?
It's not a feasibility study, it's a pre-feasibility study.
Sorry, pre-feasibility study.
A feasibility study would cost much more than we right now have. We intend to get the results by October, the finalized results. And if it's positive, as I mentioned, in the second phase, we do the front-end engineering design. So that's really a very detailed work to do, but it will be the next phase if the pre-feasibility study shows that it's a doable option, the NGCC, natural combined cycle.
Mm-hmm. Now, you identified 5 sort of key issues or barriers in one of your early slides, but if you had to pick one main challenge for developing countries in implementing CCS, what would it be?
Can I pick 2?
Yes, you can pick 2.
It's very difficult to boil to one, but a combination of capacity plus availability of financing. Because as I said, even if financing becomes available tomorrow, it's impossible to implement because there is no capacity. And it's vice versa. I mean, if there is capacity, but there is no funding, there is no use of this capacity.
Now that's interesting because often, people might be, cost or lack of regulatory framework, but the fact that you think from your experience, it's sort of lack of capacity, sort of presumably technical and legal and regulatory would be one of the main barriers.
Yes, exactly. Because it can be legal frameworks can be developed if people who are knowledgeable about the legislation are in place.
Now, what do you? I know in my work with the developing countries here at the Institute, cost is always raised as an issue. So as an engineer, Natalia, what do you think are the main opportunities to reduce the cost of CCS? Where's the R&D effort should be focused?
Definitely on the capture technology. That's where the cost barrier is. It can be several avenues. I know that some vendors, some technology providers are focusing on developing better absorbent materials. Some innovative technologies, maybe also improve membranes. It may take longer time, but it has the opportunity. And what would be really good if this speed up of utilization technologies, because that's where the value of CCS will become clear. Not only cost absorption, but revenue production. And some of the projects which are close to operation, like the Kemper County, it's not exactly a power generation project because the revenue stream comes mainly from hydrogen production, from fertilizer production. So it's additional revenue stream. That's
it's co-generation with these additional revenue streams.
Yeah, but these revenue streams actually exceed the power sales. Sales of electricity. That's where the efforts should be, the utilization component in the capture technology.
Well, that's an interesting then segue question. Where do you think the key utilization opportunities are? Obviously, we know EOR is one, and is already one that's being used and is really driving CCS implementation in the US, for instance. What do you see as the other utilization opportunities?
Again, it's I don't have a recipe here. Hydrogen production is very actually profitable. In my view, it's especially with if hydrogen-based power generation can take place, although it's far from any commercialization, it can be very productive. Fertilizer also, I mean, it's a good one. I don't know, building materials, but building materials, again, the scale is a little bit low to make it the cost recovery feasible. Hydrogen is the most highly priced commodity, can be.
And I guess on that too, almost not to answer my own question, but the Institute has a really good report on our website by Parkins Brinkerhoff on CO2 utilization uses and opportunities. So that's a little segue there. But moving on to the next question, Natalia, what other developing countries were shortlisted as having high potential for CCS? And is it too late for others to apply for World Bank funding to do a feasibility study?
We did not, how to say, our strategy was first of all to concentrate on the countries which do not have other than the World Bank support. For instance, in the Asia region, yes, there are a lot of potential in Indonesia, China, obviously, maybe some in Vietnam. But we need to know in order to move there, we need to understand what the Asian Development Bank does and what will be our value added in these countries. So outside the Asia region, we did studies in Egypt, Jordan, Kosovo, Botswana, the Maghreb countries. Why we didn't select other countries? First of all, again, I said CCS is not prominent in their, either they don't have climate change policies or they did not include CCS as one of the flagship programs like South Africa did. We just finished a project in Botswana, and at this point, even if they apply for a feasibility study, it might take some time to assess whether it makes sense, cost-wise, and spending the efforts there. But in addition to that, I mentioned that our capitalization is right now at 57 million, right? If we are committed to take these two pilot projects in Mexico and South Africa forward, we already kind of committed all our funds. So at this moment, we don't have spare funds to provide additional for feasibility study because it's expensive and expensive exercise. So our preference is to finish what we started instead of spreading again wider and not finishing the started work. So yes, the applications are welcome, and we will be talking with the donors what else we can do in terms of fundraising. But at the moment, the target is let's finish what we started.
Yeah. And I know from sort of working with you, Natalia, my understanding is it wasn't the World Bank that chose the countries to work with. You, like all the World Bank sort of processes, put out a call and then the countries self-select. Is that correct?
Well, in the first phase, yes, that's what we put it out. But in the second phase, no, we talk one-on-one, and South Africa is actually came both. It was our selection, but also their call.
Yes,
they were so much advanced.
All right. So you've touched there in that question on some of the other countries that you've done studies in. Do you see the same sort of issues and challenges coming up in all the countries, or are they different for each country?
No, it's not like uniform. I mean, the issues are all there, but the level of how to say uh, the level of the priority of the challenges may be different. Some countries are very good on better on the regulatory frameworks and all. For instance, if you compare Mexico and South Africa, right? Mexico is quite sophisticated in oil gas regulation legislation, which is helpful for CCS. And at the same time, South Africa doesn't have too much of oil and gas reserves. That's why their legislation is mainly mineral exploration, which is different from oil and gas and requires more work. So while the countries may be comparable in terms of their economic development, in terms of regulations and legislature applicable to CCS, they might be different. In terms of their ability to provide finance and to support CCS, there's definitely a huge variation. They can all, I mean, until recently, Mexico with its rich oil reserves was quite comfortable of co-financing the project, while in South Africa, it took the National Treasury quite a time to allocate the funding for this project. So, I mean, in these terms, they're different, but the list of barriers, which, in my view, are applicable in developing countries, are practically all the same. But the degrees of challenges are different.
Yeah. So those five themes that you identified, I think it was in your first or second slide, are kind of applicable to all countries, but how they play out in the different countries can be quite different.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I understand that the World Bank has stopped lending to developing countries for coal-fired power stations unless it has CCS. Is that correct? And has this prompted any countries to consider CCS where they otherwise hadn't, or perhaps considered it more closely?
We have the energy policy directions, which, yes, in principle, we can lend to coal-fueled facilities only in case they have an CCS. In practice, it didn't happen. We didn't have any applications because the problem will be very difficult to convince the board, even if it's with CCS. And knowing this, we kind of warn our client countries that it would be problematic. So if you really consider it, be prepared. But so far, we didn't have any specific requests to fund it. In South Africa, we lended a huge amount of funds to construct the Medupi power plant, which is not CCS ready. But after this long, no further applications was submitted to us.
But do you think that it in the future that countries might consider CCS if they want a coal-fired power station and to be funded by the World Bank? Do you think it will have an impact in the future?
They would consider, but again, it comes, don't forget that if we require CCS, that, they're concerned that the power output will be much less than, without CCS, plus the cost will be, and who will be paying the incremental cost? If this is clarified, then it would be much easier for them to consider. Otherwise, they see it, as I said, they see it only a cost implication out of CCS. So we have to definitely educate them that cost is.
And that sort of goes back to your answer to an earlier question. What's really important is capacity and availability of finance for CCS.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Now, you mentioned these questions around development. Your comment around, development often takes priority over climate change policies in developing countries. But we know from the World Bank's excellent report called Turn Down the Heat that climate change and the impact of climate change on development will be massive and might even undermine gains made. So do you think that message has sunk in developing countries? So in some ways, it's not really development over climate change. It's really, investing in climate change strategies because it's such an important development issue. Do you think that message has sunk in?
No, I don't think it's sunken. It does, reflect in some countries, like, I can give you Bangladesh is really considered. The question is whether they want to address mitigation or adaptation. In many instances, they opt for adaptation, and we help them. We have adaptation funds, we have some other grant sources to do it. But again, we should not forget that in each country we have a political system, right? And when the politicians, especially fresh ones, come to power, they try to emphasize the development and put all the burden on climate change and rather on developed countries. And basically, every time when a new election happens, you have to educate the new government how it's important. And sometimes you have to repeat the cycle several times over a decade or more than a decade in order to get the message across. But I would not say it's not considered. It's definitely the change is obvious, especially with the progress on deployment of renewables. Look, all developing countries right now are deploying renewables, so I think CCS will be next in line.
And that sort of almost ties back to you mentioned in one of your first slides that South Africa is quite advanced in their climate change policy. And I just was wondering why that was, and if that was because that message around the importance of development had sunk in and had sort of transferred across, successive governments. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, it's the case. Plus, we should not forget that South Africa is a very specific case. It's a coal-dependent country, and they do realize it. Without mitigating coal impact, there is not too many options. Even renewables would make very little impact on this. And even some less developed countries like Bangladesh Bangladesh in particular, even questioning right now whether CCS is a technology for them to look at. Well,
I'm going to have to wrap it up there. It's now 7:30. 7:30 in the morning for us in Australia, and 5:30, I think, for you, Natalia. So I think we got through most of the questions. However, if there was a question that you still wanted to answer that we didn't get to, then please do submit them to the Institute through the webinar inbox, and the email for that is there on the slide now. Just a reminder that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the Institute's website along with a copy of the presentation in the coming days. And of course, the other two webinars in this series are already available to listen to on our website. And lastly, as you are leaving the session today, we've put together a very quick 3-question survey and would really appreciate you taking the time to complete it because it does help us to improve our webinar program. And on that note, I want to thank Natalia again, and I certainly hope that you found this webinar interesting and valuable. So thank you for your attendance, and goodbye.